Game engines are always at the center of discourse around game development, and that's because they are essential to pretty much everything, shaping the performance, the visual identity of the game, its technical capabilities, and even the timeline for development. A good engine or a bad engine in its implementation is a matter of life or death. A ready-to-go engine like Unreal Engine can save a development team months or even years, allowing them to focus on crafting compelling gameplay experiences and content. On the other hand, Unreal definitely has its own shortcomings, on top of the fact that developers have to pay a royalty fee for it. This can make the idea of a proprietary engine very alluring, though doing so is incredibly costly and takes a significant amount of time. It can also come with technical difficulties that create tremendous setbacks, and the Final Fantasy series is no stranger to the challenges of game engine development. Over the years, its engines have created many trials and tribulations for Square Enix. However, recent titles like Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy have navigated this landscape with far fewer issues. But when we look back, there is a long and messy history to Final Fantasy game engines. To begin, however, we have to understand what a game engine even is. A game engine is a software framework that streamlines the creation of video games by offering essential tools and reusable components, enabling developers to focus on game design and gameplay. You don't have to spend time working on things such as the rendering or physics, as usually an entire suite of tools is included for you in the package. This makes the incredibly daunting task of building a game much more efficient and accessible. So back in the era of the Famicom and Super Famicom, developers didn't really have engines in the way that we think of them today, and the 2D Final Fantasy games were entirely custom built from the ground up with no formal engine. You see, in the early days of game development, the constraints of hardware heavily influenced how games were coded. Developers had to work directly with the hardware, as these early game consoles didn't have things like operating systems to streamline the process. This approach, while functional for the time, posed significant challenges. Just the act of porting a game to a different piece of hardware often required very substantial portions of its code to be heavily rewritten, as there wasn't an efficient way to translate a game's logic and assets across platforms. Also, games during this period were frequently coded from scratch every time, without reusing or optimizing code for future projects. It might also be this exact same method that is now seen as wasteful that helped them exceed the expectations of what everyone thought was possible with gaming at the time. Final Fantasy VI best exemplifies this, as Hironobu Sakaguchi says, quote, "Actually, we didn't plan to make the world of ruin at all." Yoshinori Kitase adds, "We originally planned for the party to save the world and defeat Kefka, just as things were looking grim and the world was about to be destroyed. Then, we start talking about reworking that." Sakaguchi elaborates further, saying, "The game was coming along more smoothly than we expected, so we were able to free up some time in our schedule before the release date and implement that." This tells you a lot about game development during this era. There was no clear need for the time-saving technologies of modern game engines. Game dev was going so quickly that it seemed unnecessary. However, everything would change with Final Fantasy VII. FF7 would be the most ambitious and complex Final Fantasy yet. It would use an entirely different style with pre-rendered backgrounds mixed with 3D characters. For battles, everything would be rendered in full 3D for the first time in the series, as well as a full 3D world map. It would also have cutting-edge full-motion videos using the latest CG graphics, and multiple minigames spread across 3 full CD-ROMs. Final Fantasy VII would be the first time the developers used something that vaguely resembles an engine that we see today. An engine that I personally like to call Mom Spaghetti, because I think it's an accurate descriptor of it. I don't think any modern game is coded like this, and that is probably a very good thing. Squaresoft was incredibly ambitious with FF7. They wanted a scope in which the game industry had never seen before, and so to handle all this complex data and gameplay systems, the team had to work hard to engineer a game that had multiple gameplay states it could change to at any time. To explain what I mean by a gameplay state refers to a distinct mode or system within the game that dictates how the player interacts with the world and how the game processes data. And of course, each one of these distinct modes has their own rules, mechanics, and interactions that change depending on the context. So for example, in FF7, the game switches between states like exploration on the field, battle scenes, navigation on the world map, and minigames. and each one of those has unique mechanics and visuals. And in fact, oftentimes each one has their own unique set of character models, such as how the character models on the field appear different than the ones in battle. FF7 operated on 6 distinct core modules, each responsible for different parts of the experience. These modules were the kernel, the field engine, the battle engine, the menu engine, the world map engine, and the minigame engine. The kernel module managed the core gameplay systems, handling background functions such as saving and loading and event scripting. Essentially, this is the module that holds all the other modules together. Furthermore, these engines had to be really efficient. The Sony PlayStation only had 2 megabytes of RAM, which is insane to think about by today's standards. So the game could only keep one major module in memory at a time. So whenever you entered a battle, the game would effectively dump the field module out of memory and load the battle module, then swap back afterward. This modular approach was a clever solution to squeeze such a huge game into tight memory. These engines would seamlessly transition between each other, and this is what allowed them to achieve the monumental scale of FF7. Bear in mind, this is simplifying the overview of FF7's engine alone, and there's a lot more information to talk about on this game's engine specifically. But the point here is that FF7's multifaceted engine is what facilitated the game's unprecedented scope of content. However, the push for a unified development infrastructure and engine can actually be traced back to Final Fantasy Tactics. At the time, the game's artists requested a quicker way to preview their work as it would appear in the final game. Since game development takes place on PCs, the graphics would appear differently on PCs than how they would appear actually rendering on the PlayStation console. Initially, previewing the visuals on a console was a slow process, requiring all the data to be transferred from the PC to the PlayStation. To streamline this, programmer Taku Murata developed an instant preview tool that allowed for real-time visualization. This real-time preview system greatly boosted artists' productivity and became a tool that Squaresoft reused for later projects. For example, in Vagrant Story, the team took the Final Fantasy Tactics preview tool and expanded it into a unified editor for the game's fully 3D graphics and cutscenes. In essence, Murata's work ended up being the first reusable engine component and editor that could carry over into the next project. Final Fantasy X and XII were also built using technology specifically for these games without much reuse between them. Building tech in-house for the purpose of a single game was very typical for Japanese developers at this time. However, Western developers were beginning to make the transition to licensing and reusing game engines. They had discovered by reusing code, they were able to make bigger, more dynamic games faster and more cost-effective. This issue would only become more pressing with the advent of the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, where games would finally make the jump into the HD era, which would also make them tremendously more complex. It was around the time of Final Fantasy XII's development that Square Enix would become aware of this. However, the issue is that each production team wanted to use their own tools, making finding a common ground very difficult. Cross-platform development was also becoming increasingly popular, and without an engine, this would mean that games would require heavy rewrites in order to work across different platforms. Writing a game's code to work for a single platform would no longer work. Reusable, flexible, multi-platform game engines had to be developed. Unfortunately, this would all lead Square Enix to create Crystal Tools. Originally known as the White Engine, it was first demonstrated by showing what a remake of Final Fantasy VII would look like running on the PlayStation 3 hardware. It was insanely impressive for a game that we were never actually going to get until 15 years later when we actually did get it, and in large part was due to this technical demo. Crystal Tools would also go on to power the Fabula Nova Crystallis project, this being Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy Versus 13, as well as Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, rest in peace. In 2006, Final Fantasy XIII was officially announced with a stunning trailer that captivated audiences. A young Night Sky Prince would watch in awe and was blown away not only by the graphics, but what also appeared to be a revolutionary combat system. Term I am using loosely here, as none of the footage featured actually is gameplay. Instead, the trailer showcased a pre-rendered cinematic using approximations with in-game assets, which you might hear called in the industry rendered targets, aka what they're targeting with the final game, but is not inherently representative of it. The combat scenes were designed to highlight the cinematic, action-oriented qualities of battle while maintaining the franchise's signature menu-driven ATB roots. The trailer created enormous hype, but the reality behind the scenes was far less glamorous. Developing for the PlayStation 3 proved to be a notoriously challenging task, with Square Enix, like many studios worldwide, struggling to write efficient code for its complex architecture. However, the goal was to have Crystal Tools streamline development across all their major projects, but laying the groundwork for this engine took several years, and temporarily reduced the size of the development team as they focused on technical research using pre-production assets. But despite all of this, Crystal Tools itself faced a problematic development cycle. Square Enix ambitiously tried to use it for 3 major titles simultaneously, one being a linear Final Fantasy title, the other one being an ambitious action open world game, and the third game being an MMORPG. 3 totally different types of games, and accommodating for all the specifications of those games is likely a big part of what led to failure. Final Fantasy XIII director Motomu Toriyama explained, "Because we were so focused on creating an engine for next-gen hardware that could be utilized across all platforms, we made the mistake of trying to accommodate every single project that was in progress at the time. In hindsight, it should have been obvious that it would be impossible to fully satisfy all these needs. As a result, we spent a considerable amount of time prioritizing all the different requests and ended up not being able to determine the final spec requirements. This created a standstill between the engine and game development teams, because if the engine specs couldn't be finalized, neither could the games. As debates continued without resolution, the timetable was also affected. Eventually, Square Enix decided to prioritize Final Fantasy XIII's need for the engine, allowing its development to move forward. While this decision enabled Final Fantasy XIII to finally overcome its initial hurdles, it left Final Fantasy Versus 13 and Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 out in the cold to die. And I mean that fairly literally, considering what happened, as it caused significant challenges that would basically be the demise of both of these projects. Crystal Tools would end up being entirely optimized for very linear games. Both Versus 13 and Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 would have a real-time day-night cycle, but in Final Fantasy XIII, the lighting was pre-baked, meaning that the engine wouldn't be able to support the type of dynamic lighting that they needed. FF14, of course, featuring big maps with tons of NPCs, characters, and other things on the map, with the engine not optimized for this, would see terrible performance issues. The issues ran so deep with Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 that the only way to solve it was to wipe the game completely and rebuild it with a brand new engine. And it would use an engine that Square Enix was already cooking up behind the scenes to support the next mainline Final Fantasy title, and they would call this engine the Black Engine, or the Ebony Engine, being the absolute opposite of Crystal Tools' codename White Engine. It began development during the production of Final Fantasy XIII-2 to directly address the issues of Crystal Tools. Square Enix was having tremendous trouble with Final Fantasy Versus 13, as well as the aftermath of Final Fantasy XIV's horrendous launch, with 14 1.0 being the only mainline Final Fantasy that the company has ever apologized for. Looking at popular engines like Unity and Unreal, Square wanted to create their own easy-to-use, highly flexible engine. Unlike Crystal Tools, Ebony would be able to handle large open worlds. Eventually, Ebony would evolve into the Luminous Engine. They would demonstrate its power by showing off a tech demo called Agni's Philosophy, a mind-blowingly good tech demo. Now, unlike the previous tech demos where Square would use an existing game remade in current tech, this was a completely original demonstration, and a game that I still, to this day, wish was a full Final Fantasy. Agni's Philosophy was impressive, but it was really when they finally showed off Final Fantasy Versus 13 after years of hiatus, was now Final Fantasy 15 and running on this brand new engine that it began to generate excitement. But this engine wasn't just going to power the newly announced Final Fantasy 15, it was also going to power Kingdom Hearts 3. With Luminous Studio, real-time scenes in Final Fantasy 15 would have 5 million polygons per frame, with character models made up of about 100,000 polygons each, and ultimately, it provided a generational leap from Crystal Tools. Everything sounded incredibly exciting with Square Enix's brand new Luminous Engine, until it wasn't. It would later be announced that Kingdom Hearts 3 was being moved off of the engine. This was already somewhat troubling for the impending release of Final Fantasy XV, as it immediately signaled that the engine was having problems yet again and needed to become proven with one game first before it immediately tried to spread itself thin. Progress on Luminous would become a huge impedance for FF15, though it would become one of the most successful Final Fantasy games of all time financially. And by the end, it felt like they ultimately had a slightly less disastrous version of Crystal Tools. However, Square Enix would try to go and evolve production on the engine. They would go on to create a brand new studio called Luminous Studios, specifically for the further development of this engine. To facilitate this, they would also create a brand new game called Project Athia, a game that would have the great misfortune of becoming Forspoken. Luminous Studio would go on to make this new IP while continuing to work on the engine, but the game was a critical and financial failure, and this would bring the engine's development to a complete halt, at least as far as the public is aware of as of the recording of this video. So by this point, you would think that Square Enix would give up the pursuit of proprietary engines altogether. Like, every single time it's resulted in a ton of failure, right? And they would go on with Unreal Engine to power games such as Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy, Dragon Quest XI, and Kingdom Hearts 3, so certainly at this point, they had to have given up. And the answer to that is no. With the development of Final Fantasy XVI, they still made the choice to start over from scratch again. However, Creative Studio 3 clarified that they did not use Luminous in any way. But why dump Luminous as an engine, other than the obvious? It still at least works, right? Well, according to Yoshi P, Luminous did not have a manual, saying, quote, "There's a reason we didn't use Luminous. When we started work on Final Fantasy XVI, they were still working on Final Fantasy XV, I think on the DLC. They hadn't created a manual for Luminous yet, so the studio couldn't provide us with support because they were focused on their own game. So we knew it wasn't going to work." So even though Creative Studio 3 would have actually used Luminous, the documentation on the engine was so far behind that nobody outside of Luminous Studio actually knew how to work on the engine. And this is one of the problems that you'll run into with proprietary engines. It's great for the team that's working on it and who understands how the engine works. However, you have to create documentation and instructional content on how to actually use it. Ask any developer that's ever taken over a project that has no documentation written on it, and they will tell you just how awful it is. And that was the state of Luminous Engine, and why Yoshi P and his team rejected it. Of course, contrasting this with engines like Unreal, and why so many companies adopted, there's literally endless documentation, videos, tutorials, classes, all kinds of information that you can find about Unreal anywhere. You can already hire developers who have experience with Unreal, years of experience, something that you can't do with an engine that you created in-house. Creative Studio 3 would then go on to create their own engine for Final Fantasy XVI. However, one advantage that they had that they did not have with the creation of Crystal Tools or Luminous was the inclusion of Sony first-party engineers. They directly provided the team assistance to make sure that the game ran as smoothly as possible. The engine itself, however, is not without issues. In performance mode, the game struggles to maintain a consistent frame rate and can oftentimes dip into 720p via dynamic resolution in order to keep 60 frames per second. And whatever Square Enix's Creative Studio 3 does next with it, we can only hope that it continues to improve on the engine and avoids the mistakes of the past. As for the name of Final Fantasy XVI's engine, according to Yoshi P, it doesn't have a name yet. So actually, you guys should name it in the comments below. From an outsider perspective, it can certainly be hard to see any justification in Square Enix continuing to make proprietary engines. They've caused catastrophic domino effects that arguably we are still feeling to this day. The track record shows that while in-house tech can produce stunning results, it can often come with long delays, poor documentation, major onboarding challenges for new teams that provide very little benefit for us as consumers. By contrast, Unreal Engine offers a well-supported ecosystem with extensive documentation and a powerful toolset that allows even small teams to roll out incredible games. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a perfect AAA case study. Its heavily customized build of Unreal Engine 4 enabled a remarkable remarkably fast turnaround for a game of its scale, especially when you compare it to the extraordinarily problematic timelines of games made on Crystal Tools or Luminous. The benefits of a custom engine, however, is that you have a game that is highly tailored to the targeted performance and control over the game's specific technical needs and visual identity. Final Fantasy XIII being a prime example, a PlayStation 3 game that is still a visual marvel even in the modern day, all because of the amount of effort they put into Crystal Tools to run that one specific game. And it only came at the very small, tiny price of absolutely destroying every other game that was meant to run on that engine to the point of cancellation. This is not to say that proprietary engines always have to end bad. Just look at the RE engine, which, by the way, apparently stands for Reach for the Moon engine and not Resident Evil engine. And yes, that is the dumbest thing ever. Because why is it called the RE engine? Wouldn't that make it the Reach for the Moon engine? Anyways, RE engine has been a massive success for Capcom, with nearly all of their modern catalog being built on the software, though even it has some issues with certain games that are somewhat out of its scope, such as Monster Hunter Wilds and its performance issues across multiple platforms, though undeniably it runs Resident Evil games amazingly. All in all, hopefully the days of Square Enix's engine troubles are behind us, and their games going forward will be made with reliable toolsets. Until then, make sure you have that subscribe button and bell icon clicked, and I'll see you all in the next video. Later, guys.